Stalag XB, Bad Orb, Germany. January 1945. The interrogation room smelled of damp concrete and coal smoke, a single bulb casting shadows that climbed the walls like fingers. Hauptmann Werner Hoffman sat across from the newly captured American soldier, clipboard ready, questions prepared. The prisoner was black, which aligned with German propaganda about American military inferiority. Then the American opened his mouth and spoke. Not in broken English requiring translation, but in flawless Berlin German, accent perfect, grammar impeccable. Hoffman's pen stopped moving. Everything he had been taught about race suddenly collided with impossible reality. Sergeant James Williams had been captured 3 days earlier during the Battle of the Bulge. His unit, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, one of the few black combat units in the European theater, had been overrun near Bastogne when German forces launched their surprise winter offensive. He had fought for 18 hours, artillery pieces firing until ammunition ran out, then rifles until those too were empty. When German infantry surrounded the remaining defenders, surrender was the only option left. Williams was 26 years old, from New York City's Harlem, the son of academic parents who had spent 2 years in Berlin during the 1920s. His father had been a visiting professor at Humboldt University, teaching American literature to German students hungry for transatlantic cultural exchange. Young James, then aged 6 and 7, had attended German schools, played with German children, absorbed the language with the effortless fluency of childhood immersion. By the time his family returned to New York in 1926, James spoke German as naturally as English. His parents encouraged him to maintain both languages, seeing bilingualism as intellectual advantage. Through his teenage years, he read German newspapers available in Harlem's immigrant communities, listened to German radio broadcasts, corresponded with pen pals in Stuttgart and Hamburg. When the war began, his German language skills should have made him valuable for intelligence work. But the Army's segregation policies meant black soldiers were relegated to support roles: quartermasters, engineers, transportation. Combat positions were rare. Intelligence work, requiring trust and access to sensitive information, was simply not offered to black servicemen regardless of qualifications. Williams had pushed back, arguing his case through official channels, writing letters to commanders explaining his fluency, his cultural knowledge, his potential value. The responses were polite rejections. His skills were noted in his file, but never utilized. Instead, he was assigned to the 333rd Field Artillery, where at least he could fight, even if the Army refused to let him think strategically. The capture had been chaotic. German soldiers emerging from winter fog, shouting orders Williams understood perfectly before they were translated. The surrender process, hands raised, weapons dropped, marching in columns toward collection points. Then the transport, crowded trucks moving through frozen landscape toward processing facilities deeper in Germany. Williams had kept his German fluency concealed during the initial capture. Other black soldiers in his unit had whispered warnings. Don't let them know you speak German. They might think you're a spy, might treat you worse. The advice was based on fear more than evidence, but Williams followed it. He stayed silent, responded to orders through gestures. Let German guards assume he understood nothing beyond the universal language of rifles pointed at prisoners. But 3 days into captivity, transferred to Stalag XB for processing, Williams was separated from other American prisoners and brought to the interrogation room. Standard procedure questioning captured soldiers for tactical intelligence, unit identifications, strategic information that might be useful. Hauptmann Werner Hoffman conducted these interrogations routinely. He had processed hundreds of American prisoners since 1943, developing efficient methods for extracting information while maintaining Geneva Convention protocols. He spoke functional English, enough to ask questions and understand responses. Most interrogations were predictable: name, rank, serial number, refusal to provide additional information, acceptance of that refusal, because Geneva Conventions protected prisoners from coercive questioning. But Hoffman approached Williams with different assumptions. The German regime's propaganda had been explicit about Black Americans intellectually inferior, culturally primitive, included in the American military only because the United States was desperate for manpower. The propaganda films showed black soldiers as comic figures, incapable of sophisticated military thinking, speaking broken English, serving white officers who viewed them with contempt. Hoffman had absorbed these teachings without much critical examination. He had never met a black person before the war. His understanding came entirely from propaganda, from film reels, from official messaging that insisted on racial hierarchies that justified German superiority. When Williams entered the interrogation room, Hoffman saw what he expected to see: confirmation of propaganda narratives. He prepared to conduct a simple questioning session, expecting limited intelligence value, planning to process Williams quickly and move to more promising subjects. He began with standard questions in English. Name? Williams looked at him steadily, evaluating, making a decision that would alter both their understandings of the world. He responded in perfect German. Sergeant James Williams, United States Army, 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. The silence that followed was profound. Hoffman's pen stopped moving mid-stroke. He looked up from his clipboard, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, recalibration. Williams held his gaze, watching the propaganda collapse in real time across the German officer's face. Hoffman recovered his composure with visible effort. He set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, studied Williams with new attention. When he spoke, it was in German. You speak German? Yes. Williams's accent was unmistakably Berlin, the educated pronunciation of someone who had learned the language, young, and maintained it carefully. Where did you learn? I lived in Berlin from 1923 to 1926. My father taught at Humboldt University. Hoffman processed this information slowly, comparing it against everything he had been taught. Black Americans were supposed to be uneducated, unsophisticated, incapable of the kind of academic background Williams was describing. Yet here was evidence that contradicted those teachings sitting across from him. Speaking German, it was better than some native speakers Hoffman knew. Your father was a professor? American literature. He taught courses on Whitman, Emerson, Thoreau. He published papers on transcendentalist philosophy in German academic journals. Was becoming more impossible by the sentence. Not just a black American who spoke German, but one whose father was an intellectual, who had moved in academic circles, who had contributed to German scholarship. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Hoffman tried a different approach. Perhaps the German was memorized, rehearsed phrases rather than genuine fluency. He shifted to more complex questions. Tell me about Berlin in the 1920s. What was it like? Williams understood what Hoffman was testing. He responded with detail that could only come from lived experience. We lived in Charlottenburg, near the Technical University. I attended Grundschule on Gotha Straße. My friends were Klaus, who lived in the apartment above ours, and Margaret, whose father owned the bakery on the corner. Saturday mornings we went to Tiergarten to feed ducks in the lake. Sunday afternoons, my family attended concerts at the Philharmonie. I remember the smell of fresh bread from every corner bakery, the sound of church bells, the way snow fell soft on Christmas Eve, while carollers sang Still Nacht. Hoffman felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding. This wasn't memorization. This was memory, rich and specific, the kind of detail that comes from childhood lived in a place. Williams wasn't pretending to know Berlin. He genuinely knew it, possibly better than Hoffman knew it himself, having only visited the capital 3 times in his life. How is this possible? Hoffman asked quietly, the question directed as much at himself as at Williams. How is what possible? That a black American speaks German? That my family valued education? That we were welcomed in Berlin? Williams's voice carried no hostility, just gentle challenge to assumptions Hoffman was beginning to question. We were taught ... double quotes. Hoffman stopped, uncertain how to continue without stating propaganda that suddenly sounded hollow, even in his own mind. That Black Americans are inferior? That we lack intelligence or culture? I know what you are taught. But you're talking to me right now, in German, about Berlin in the 1920s, about my father's academic work, about my childhood friends. Does this match what you were taught? Hoffman had no answer. The evidence before him contradicted years of indoctrination. He could try to dismiss Williams as an exception, an anomaly that didn't disprove the general rule. But doubt had been planted, growing fast, roots spreading through the certainty he had built his worldview upon. He changed topics, returning to official interrogation protocols. He asked about Williams's unit, its composition, its recent operations. Williams provided name, rank, serial number, the minimum required by Geneva Conventions, but refused tactical information. This refusal was itself significant. He understood military protocol, knew his rights as a prisoner, navigated the interrogation with sophistication that propaganda insisted black soldiers couldn't possess. The session continued for 90 minutes. Hoffman asked questions, sometimes in German, sometimes in English, testing, probing, trying to find the limits of Williams's knowledge. Each answer revealed more complexity, more education, more direct contradiction to propaganda narratives. Finally, Hoffman called for guards to return Williams to the prisoner barracks. As Williams stood to leave, Hoffman spoke quietly. I do not understand how everything I was taught can be so wrong. Williams looked at him directly. Maybe start by questioning who taught you and why they wanted you to believe those things. After Williams left, Hoffman sat alone in the interrogation room, staring at his clipboard where he had written, Subject, Negro American soldier. Initial assessment, low intelligence, limited communication ability. He drew a line through those words. Then he sat thinking about Berlin in the 1920s, about a Black American family moving through German academic circles, about a child learning German in Charlottenburg, about what else might be lies. Williams was housed in a section of Stalag XB, designated for American prisoners. The camp held thousands of Americans, British, French, Soviets, all segregated by nationality and often by race. The American section was itself divided, with black prisoners housed separately from white prisoners, the Army's segregation policies continuing even in captivity. Word spread quickly among the black prisoners that Williams spoke German. Several others in the 333rd had known his language skills were no secret within the unit, but most prisoners from other units were surprised. Within days, Williams became an informal leader, translating guard commands, helping navigate camp bureaucracy, advocating for better conditions, using language skills that gave him unusual access to German administrators. His role created complications for the German command. Hoffman reported Williams's fluency up the chain, noting the disconnect between propaganda and reality. The response was mixed. Some officers dismissed it as irrelevant. One educated Black American didn't disprove general racial theories. Others were disturbed, beginning to question other propaganda they had accepted without examination. Williams was called for additional questioning sessions. Different officers, different approaches, all trying to reconcile his existence with their trained beliefs. One interrogator, a Captain Dietrich Mueller, who had studied anthropology before the war, engaged Williams in extended discussions about race, culture, education, American society. Mueller asked, "How many Black Americans have university education?" Williams responded, "More than you've been told. My father's colleagues at Columbia included several black professors. Howard University in Washington is entirely black faculty and students. We have doctors, lawyers, scientists, artists. We face discrimination, certainly, but we are not the primitive people your propaganda describes. But in your military, you serve in segregated units. You are not permitted the same roles as white soldiers. Does this not suggest? It suggests that America has its own racism, Williams interrupted. I never claimed America was perfect, but our racism is policy, not biology. It's based on prejudice that can change, not on fixed hierarchies that your leadership claims are natural and permanent. These conversations affected Mueller profoundly. He wrote in his diary, later preserved in archives, I have spent a week questioning an American soldier who speaks German better than I speak English, who discusses philosophy with sophistication. I rarely encounter who challenges every assumption I held about race. Either the propaganda is entirely false, or this man is such an extreme exception that his existence proves nothing. But I find myself unable to believe he is unique. If America can produce one black intellectual, why not thousands? And if thousands, what does that mean about everything else we have been taught? Other black prisoners began asserting their own educational backgrounds, emboldened by Williams's example. Corporal Thomas Anderson had been a teacher in Chicago, spoke some German learned in high school, could discuss Goethe and Schiller. Private Robert Johnson had studied chemistry at a historically black college, could explain complex scientific concepts when German guards with similar backgrounds engaged him in conversation. The cumulative effect was German guards and officers encountering repeated contradictions to propaganda. Not isolated anomalies, but a pattern black American prisoners who were educated, articulate, thoughtful, capable of the kind of intellectual discourse that propaganda insisted they couldn't achieve. Some Germans responded by doubling down on racist ideology. These prisoners were obviously exceptions, or possibly lying about their backgrounds, or somehow not representative. But others, like Mueller and Hoffman, found their certainties cracking, replaced by uncomfortable questions about what else they might have been deceived about. Williams recognized the opportunity his position created. He began conducting informal education sessions for other black prisoners, teaching them basic German phrases that would help them navigate camp life, but also teaching them how to engage with German guards in ways that challenged assumptions. He coached them. When they expect ignorance, show knowledge. When they expect simplicity, show complexity. Every interaction is a chance to disprove the lies they've been fed. This wasn't naive idealism. Williams understood that individual Germans changing their minds would end the war or overturn the regime's policies. But he also understood that ideas mattered, that propaganda only worked when it remained unchallenged, that forcing Germans to confront contradictions between propaganda and reality was itself a form of resistance. By March 1945, Williams had become something unusual in the camp, a prisoner with unexpected influence, not through rank or physical dominance, but through linguistic and intellectual ability that Germans couldn't ignore. He mediated disputes between prisoners and guards, translated official communications, even advised camp administrators on how to manage the American prisoner population more effectively. This last role created ethical complications. Was he collaborating by helping Germans run the camp efficiently? He wrestled with this question, ultimately concluding that making prison life marginally better for other prisoners justified the cooperation, especially since the war was clearly ending, and his assistance wasn't contributing to German military effectiveness. In April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on central Germany, conditions at Stalag XB deteriorated. Food became scarce, medical supplies ran out, guard rotations became irregular. The camp existed in strange limbo still, officially functioning but increasingly aware that liberation or collapse was imminent. During this period, Williams's relationship with several German guards evolved beyond simple prisoner-captor dynamics. Hoffman, in particular, sought Williams out for conversations that had nothing to do with interrogation and everything to do with Hoffman trying to understand how his worldview had been so comprehensively false. They talked one evening in early April, sitting in the camp administration building while spring rain fell outside. Hoffman asked a question that had been troubling him for months. How do I trust anything now? If the propaganda about race was completely false, what else is false? Everything? How do I know what's true? Williams considered carefully before responding. You start by questioning claims that require you to believe some people are inherently superior to others. When someone tells you that you're better than another person because of birth, because of race, because of nationality, that's when you should be most skeptical. Because those claims serve people in power, not truth. But our entire system was built on these claims. If they're false, then everything we fought for, Hoffman couldn't finish the sentence, is based on lies, Williams completed. Yes, I'm sorry, but yes. Your leadership built a system on racial superiority that has no scientific basis, no moral justification, no reality beyond the propaganda that sustained it. Meeting me doesn't create this problem. It just makes it impossible for you to ignore. Hoffman was quiet for a long time. Then, what do I do with this knowledge? You remember it. When the war ends, when Germany has to rebuild, you remember that the propaganda was lies. You tell others. You help build something different, something based on reality, rather than fantasies of superiority. You think Germany can change that fundamentally? I think people can change. Systems can change. America is deeply racist, but there are Americans fighting to change that. Germany will face the same struggle. Whether it succeeds depends on people like you remembering conversations like this. Other prisoners noticed these extended conversations between Williams and Hoffman. Some were suspicious. Why was Williams spending so much time talking with a German officer? Was he providing intelligence, collaborating, betraying other prisoners? Williams addressed these concerns directly when confronted. I'm teaching him that everything he was taught about us is false. Every conversation we have breaks down propaganda. That's valuable, not militarily, but humanly. When this war ends, German soldiers will go home. If even a few of them understand that the propaganda was lies, that matters for whatever comes next. The argument was compelling, if uncomfortable. The other prisoners grudgingly accepted that Williams wasn't collaborating in any meaningful sense, even as they remained skeptical about whether changing individual German minds accomplished anything significant. In late April, orders came to evacuate the camp. Allied forces were less than 50 miles away. German command wanted prisoners moved deeper into Germany, away from advancing armies. The evacuation was chaotic. Thousands of prisoners forced to march westward with inadequate supplies, unclear destinations, guards as confused as prisoners about what they were supposed to be doing. Williams found himself marching beside Hoffman, who had been assigned to the column as one of the guards. They talked during rest periods, during the long hours of walking, during evening stops when the column halted for the night. Hoffman asked, "When you return to America, will you tell people about these conversations?" "Probably." "Why?" "I wonder if Americans will believe that a German officer learned humanity from a black prisoner. It sounds implausible even to me, and I lived it." Williams smiled despite exhaustion. "It does sound implausible, but that's why the story matters. Implausible things are sometimes true. Propaganda requires people to believe plausible lies. Reality is more complicated." The march continued for 5 days. Then on May 2nd, the column encountered American forces. The German guards surrendered without resistance. The prisoners were liberated, processed, given medical attention, prepared for return to American control. In the chaos of liberation, Williams and Hoffman had one final conversation. Hoffman was being processed as a prisoner himself now, facing uncertain future as American forces occupied Germany. He found Williams and said simply, "Thank you for teaching me. I don't know if I can do anything useful with what I learned, but at least I learned something." Williams shook his hand, a gesture that surprised both of them. The physical acknowledgement of respect between former enemies. "Remember it," Williams said. "Remember that propaganda can be comprehensively false. Remember that reality is more complex than ideology allows." "That's enough," Williams returned to the United States in June 1945, part of a massive repatriation of American servicemen from Europe. He was processed through Fort Dix in New Jersey, given 30 days leave, officially decorated for his Service Bronze Star for valor during the Battle of the Bulge, though the circumstances of his capture meant there was little public attention to his individual story. He returned to Harlem, to his parents' apartment, to the life he had left when he enlisted. But he was changed by his experience, particularly by those months in Stalag XB, by the repeated confrontations with German soldiers, whose worldviews he had systematically dismantled through the simple fact of his existence. He spoke about these experiences at churches, at community centers, at meetings organized by civil rights groups. His message was consistent. The propaganda that told Germans that Black Americans were inferior was false. The American propaganda that claimed democracy abroad while maintaining segregation at home was also false. Both systems relied on lies that could be challenged, should be challenged, must be challenged. In 1946, he enrolled at Columbia University using GI Bill benefits, studying sociology, writing his senior thesis on racial propaganda in wartime Germany and the United States. The comparative analysis was uncomfortable for many readers. Williams drew explicit parallels between German racial theories and American segregation policies, arguing that both systems required similar propaganda mechanisms to sustain belief in hierarchies that reality contradicted. His thesis advisor tried to encourage him to soften the comparisons, worried the work was too controversial. Williams refused. "I spent 6 months proving to German soldiers that their propaganda about race was false. I'm not going to come home and pretend American propaganda is somehow more truthful. Both systems lie. Both need to be confronted with reality." The thesis was published in a sociology journal in 1948, creating minor controversy, but also establishing Williams as a serious voice in emerging civil rights scholarship. He continued his academic work, eventually earning a doctorate, becoming a professor himself teaching at Howard University, the institution that had educated his father's black colleagues decades earlier. Werner Hoffman's post-war life took a different trajectory. He was held as a prisoner of war for 18 months after Germany's surrender, processed through denazification programs, eventually released to return to civilian life in 1947. He became a teacher, working in a gymnasium in Heidelberg, teaching history to German students, trying to understand what their country had become and how it needed to change. He never forgot his conversations with Williams. In his classroom, he told the story of the Black American sergeant who spoke perfect German, who challenged everything Hoffman had been taught, who demonstrated through his existence that propaganda was comprehensively false. The story became a teaching tool about the dangers of ideology that requires belief in inherent superiority. In 1967, Hoffman wrote to Williams through American University connections. The letter was hesitant, uncertain if Williams would remember him or want to maintain contact. Hoffman explained what he was teaching, how Williams's influence had shaped his entire post-war career, how the lessons learned in that prisoner of war camp had become the foundation for his educational philosophy. Williams wrote back. They began corresponding regularly, letters exchanged 3 or 4 times annually for the next 20 years. They discussed civil rights progress in America, denazification and Reconstruction in Germany, the parallel struggles both nations faced in confronting racist histories and building more equitable futures. In 1972, Hoffman traveled to the United States, visiting Washington, D.C. for an educational conference. Williams was teaching at Howard University then, and they met in person for the first time since liberation in 1945. Both were older in their 50s, gray-haired, carrying weight that youth hadn't required, but the connection remained immediate and profound. They spent a weekend in conversation, reviewing the decades since the war, comparing notes on how both societies had changed and how much remained unchanged. Williams introduced Hoffman to his family wife, 3 children, grandchildren beginning to arrive. Hoffman met Williams's students, attended one of his lectures, saw firsthand the academic career that had developed from the foundation of those prison camp conversations. Before returning to Germany, Hoffman asked Williams, "Do you think our conversations in the camp made any difference in the larger scheme?" Williams considered, "You're teaching German students about the dangers of propaganda. I'm teaching American students about the same thing. That's 2 classrooms worth of people who might think more critically because we had those conversations. That's not nothing. It's not revolutionary, but it's not nothing. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I never interrogated you. If I had processed you quickly and moved on, would I have continued believing the propaganda? Maybe, or maybe something else would have challenged it eventually. The propaganda was built on lies. Lies eventually collide with reality. I was just one version of that collision." When Sergeant James Williams walked into that interrogation room in Stalag XB in January 1945, he carried with him the accumulated power of simple contradiction. His existence, a Black American who spoke flawless German, who had lived in Berlin, who could discuss German literature and philosophy and culture with sophistication that propaganda insisted was impossible, represented a comprehensive refutation of racial ideology that required belief in inherent hierarchies. The shock Werner Hoffman experienced wasn't just surprise at encountering unexpected linguistic ability. It was the psychological destabilization that comes when fundamental assumptions collapse suddenly and completely. For years, Hoffman had absorbed propaganda about racial inferiority. Then he sat across from a man who demonstrated, simply by speaking, that the propaganda was comprehensively false. This encounter replicated dozens of times as other German soldiers and officers interrogated, or guarded, or simply talked with. Williams represented a specific form of resistance that propaganda could uneasily counter. Violence could be met with superior violence. Military operations could be opposed with better strategy. But individual human beings who contradicted propaganda through their existence created problems that ideology couldn't solve. The German regime had spent years building an elaborate system of racial theories, supported by pseudoscientific claims, reinforced through education and media and cultural production. All of this extensive infrastructure collapsed in an interrogation room when a Black American sergeant spoke perfect German. The story challenges simplified narratives about the war. It demonstrates that fighting propaganda required not just military victory, but individual moments of human encounter that forced confrontation with reality. Williams's fluency in German was accident of biography. His parents' academic sojourn in 1920s, Berlin created linguistic ability that became unexpectedly significant 2 decades later. But that accident had profound impact, forcing individual Germans to question teachings they had never previously examined. The post-war correspondence between Williams and Hoffman, continuing for 20 years, demonstrated the lasting impact of these encounters. Hoffman didn't just change his mind about race during those prison camp conversations. He built an entire educational career on the foundation of that changed understanding. His students in Heidelberg learned to question propaganda, to examine claims of superiority skeptically, to demand evidence for ideological assertions. Similarly, Williams's academic work drew explicitly on his prisoner of war experience. His sociological research on racial propaganda, his teaching about systems of oppression, his civil rights activism, all of it connected back to those months in Stalag XB, proving to German soldiers that propaganda was false by simply existing and speaking. The story is not triumphalist. Williams returned to an America that maintained segregation, that limited opportunities for Black servicemen despite their wartime contributions. That required continued struggle for basic civil rights. Hoffman returned to a Germany devastated by war, facing decades of reconstruction and moral reckoning. Neither man's life became simple or easy because of their encounter. But both carried forward the lesson of that interrogation room. that propaganda requires distance from reality to function, that human encounter can break down ideological barriers, that speaking truth to indoctrination is itself a form of resistance. When German soldiers were shocked that black posts spoke German, that shock represented the moment when reality overwhelmed propaganda. The surprise wasn't just about language. It was about confronting the reality that people they had been taught to consider inferior were actually their intellectual equals or superiors, that the racial hierarchies they had been taught were fabrications, that their entire worldview required revision. These moments of shocked recognition, repeated across thousands of individual encounters between Black American prisoners and German guards, contributed to something larger: the slow, painful process of dismantling racial ideologies that had justified atrocity. The process was incomplete, imperfect, ongoing, even today. But it began in moments like Williams speaking German to Hoffman, forcing confrontation with reality that propaganda couldn't explain away. The lesson remains relevant. Propaganda fails when confronted with human complexity. Systems of oppression require people to accept simplistic categorizations that reality constantly contradicts. Resistance begins when individuals refuse to perform the simplified roles that ideology assigns them, when they assert their full humanity in contexts where propaganda insists such humanity doesn't exist. Williams spoke German, and in speaking, dismantled lies that millions of words of propaganda had carefully constructed.